Okay, welcome everybody to this trade session. In this session, we have 3 presenters. Each presenter will give a 20-minute presentation, followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. If you have a question, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. If you are invited to ask a question, we will enable you to unmute your microphone. Please introduce yourself by stating your name and affiliation. Please note this session will be recorded. Our first presenter will be Matthias Parey from University of Surrey. Matthias, do you want to start sharing your screen?
Right, so thank you very much for joining the session, and thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this amazing conference and for including our research in this in the program. So I'm delighted to present this paper here, which is entitled "Trade and Technology Impacts on UK Labour Markets," and it's joint work with Peter Levell from IFS. So I should say this is work in progress, so any comments would be much appreciated either during the session or also afterwards. So in this session, or in this project, we use ONS longitudinal study data. And so here's the corresponding data disclaimer. This work contains statistical data from ONS, which is Crown copyright. Any views expressed are solely those of the authors, and so cannot be taken to represent those of the Office for National Statistics. Let me give you the broad context of this project and the research question that we're aiming to ask. So our interest here is in understanding the long-run effects of changes in trade and trade arrangements on the labor market, and in particular on worker outcomes in the UK. So what we do here is that we basically study the effect of exposure to import competition from China that resulted from China's WTO accession in 2001. Now, there's a substantial existing literature on what's often called the China shock, and that builds on the seminal paper by author and co-authors from 2013, and we see our paper as contributing to that literature. What do we want to do in this paper? We want to think about what the long-run implications are at the worker level for workers in manufacturing, in particular in the UK, that are exposed to this import competition. How persistent are the shocks at the individual level, and what are the insurance mechanisms or the adjustment mechanisms that workers may choose or may be able to do? So in particular, one focus in this paper is on thinking about household level responses to this labor market shock. So the question that we want to ask is there insurance coming from the household and other members of the household in terms of labor market participation that can provide insurance to the family and to the worker? Now, overall, we think this is very much policy relevant because we are interested in the worker level effect and the worker level adjustments over a long period of time. And of course, that's an important part that one needs to understand in order to think about possible policy responses to import shocks, such as the one that we're studying here. So because this is built on a well-known and established literature, I'm going to be relatively brief in terms of the introduction. But what I do want to highlight as a way of introduction here is just the very strong rise in Chinese imports to the UK in particular that we've observed over the period. And so in this graph, you see Chinese imports as a proportion of total imports over the period 1993 to 2017, 2018. And what you can see is that these imports are are stable and at a relatively low level up to about 2000. And then afterwards, we see a very sustained and persistent rise to a different order of magnitude subsequently. So what we will do in this paper is we will look at the labor market outcomes and the changes from 2001 to 2011. So basically covering this very steep rise, and we will ask the question how workers' careers and workers' outcomes have evolved over that time period, given differential exposure to import competition. So the outline of this talk is relatively standard. So I'm going to be relatively brief on the related literature and then I'll talk about the data that we use, the estimation procedure that we adopt, and then I'll take you through some of our results, and I'll conclude. Okay, so here are pointers to some of the relevant papers in this literature. Maybe the most important ones are in this first line here. So the work by Orte, Dorn, and Hansen, 2013 and 2016, and also the worker level work that is Orte, Dorn, Hansen, and Song from 2014. Now these are for the US, and then subsequently there have been related papers that have explored the effect of the China shock for other countries, and have also sought to understand whether the effects are different for other countries. And some of these references here you see on the list, including reference to work on the UK that's by Foliano and Riley from 2017. I want to point though also to one other literature, which I think is very much relevant to the focus of our project in particular, and that is on intra-family insurance. And that's the paper by Haller, Schmieder, and Weber, which is forthcoming, and which is a paper in which the authors look at the family level labor supply responses to job losses. So it is very much related in terms of the focus on household level insurance and household level outcomes, but it looks at a very different kind of shock. So they look at job losses while we focus on responses to a trade shock and the exposure of the corresponding industry. So what do we do in this paper? So we follow individuals over relatively long time horizons. So we are able to track workers over long periods of times, and the results that I'm going to present here focus on the changes that occur between 2001 and 2011. Although in principle, one would be able to look at changes over other time horizons as well, and we have some corresponding results as well. The results that we find indicate that there are persistent effects of this trade shock over this 10-year period, and we find in particular that there are broad occupational transitions that are induced by this trade shock. So there seem to be structural changes in the labor market that are initiated by this trade shock. Now, in particular, we find that there are differences by gender. So we find important differences between men and women in our data, and also in terms of the household level insurance, we find that spouse labor supply may be one possible insurance mechanism for individuals who are affected by this shock. Let me say a little bit more about the data. So the main data that we use in this project is the ONS longitudinal study, LS. It's a large-scale data set of linked censuses that covers England and Wales. It's roughly 1% of the population over the period 1971 to 2011. So it combines the different census waves over that period. The members of the LS data are selected on the basis of 4 birthdays, so that gives you the roughly 1% of the population. And then the data set also links in some administrative life events such as births and deaths and other external data sources. So overall, this allows us to trace individuals over long periods of time, and it gives us access to a random sample that's representative of the population. And one particular advantage of this data source is that it's not conditional on a particular labor force participation status. So that means that we're able to follow individuals irrespectively of whether they participate in the labor market or whether they may exit the labor market, and so on. And I think that's quite important because it means that we don't have to make assumptions about what happens to workers who drop out of the data set, and the question whether these individuals may have left the labor force or not. So in this sense, this gives us access to a very large and stable data set that's very well suited for our question. So it gives us the panel dimension. It's representative, little attrition. It has detailed info on occupations. And also it contains information on what happens in the household in terms of demographics and also spouse labor supply. The second data set that we use for this, the second data set that we use here is the business structure database, BSD, and that is admin data that informs us about firms in the UK in terms of their employment and employment turnover and industry. So this slide just gives you our empirical model. So this is a very standard formulation. So the interest here is in understanding the effect of import exposure, i.e. on labor market outcomes, and in particular on the changes between 2001 and 2011. So the dependent variable here is delta y between 2001 and 2011, and I indexes the individual. And then we regress that on an intercept, and then our main coefficient of interest is beta 1 here, which is import exposure between 2001 and 2011 for industry J. And then we have other controls at the baseline for the individual I, and then we have a random error term epsilon. So in terms of controls, these controls include age, sex, but also dummies for one-digit industry, and that's helpful because it basically allows us to think of our estimates as being derived by comparing relatively similar industries, but these industries being exposed to a different extent by the trade shock. Our sample is all employed individuals who are aged 25 to 50 in 2001, and our analysis is at the industry level, where we use 2001 industry based on SIC 1992 classification. So here's just I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this is just just to illustrate the variation that we use. So different industries are affected by the China shock to a different extent. So here you just see some examples such as furniture, games and toys, footwear, and so on. And so what you can see is that there are differences in these across these industries in the extent of import volume from China. That is essentially the variation that we're going to exploit, that different industries are relatively similar ex ante, but then they're exposed to a differential shock. So this slide basically gives you the definition of our measure of import exposure here. So this is best thought of as a relative measure of imports by industry. So we look at the imports from China to the UK between 2001 and 2011, the change in those imports, and then we normalize that by the 1997, so by a prior value of the output plus imports minus the exports for the corresponding industry, and that basically defines that relative measure is our measure of exposure. Okay, so one concern that is that's very common in this literature is the concern that or the expectation maybe that domestic shocks that may occur in the UK may have an independent effect both on the outcomes but also on on the imports. So what we do therefore is that we want to isolate the components of imports that is really driven by the increase in Chinese exports to the UK rather than the domestic shocks in the UK. So what we do to address that is that we use an instrumental variable strategy that basically uses the changes in imports that occur to other similar countries around the world. So similar in terms of the income level. So what we do is that we look at Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Spain, Switzerland, and the United States, and we use the changes in the imports from China to those countries as a way of basically isolating the expansion of Chinese exports and to address any domestic shocks in the UK. We also conduct a falsification exercise where we use values that are prior to this trade shock as a way of documenting that our strategy works well and to support the idea that this is an empirically valid strategy. Okay, so let me take you through some of our main results. So we're going to look at employment effects of the trade exposure, occupational transitions, the occupational characteristics of the worker, and then partner employment. In terms of interpreting the coefficients that I'm going to show you, these coefficients are scaled in a way to reflect a typical exposure within the manufacturing sector. So if you consider a worker that's in the 25th percentile, and you think about moving that worker to a different industry at the 75th percentile of the exposure in the manufacturing sector, that would be corresponding to 1 unit shift in the regressor. So that's the interpretation of the coefficients on the subsequent slides. And then in addition, we have multiplied the coefficients by 100 so that we can think about them in terms of percentage changes. Okay, so here you see some of our results in terms of the employment effects, and you see different dimensions of labor market activity for the worker. You see that we have about 100,000 individuals overall in this regression, and so let me highlight some of the results. We see a negative effect on the probability of being in work. That is what you see in column 1, and we don't see significant changes in the probability of being active or employed, but we see a significant increase in the probability of being unemployed. So let me just interpret that coefficient just to provide an example. Moving a worker from the 25th to the 75th percentile of import exposure among the manufacturing workers would increase unemployment by 0.5 percentage points.
You have 5 minutes left.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Great. So this slide looks at a different way of measuring labor market outcomes. So what we do here, and this really shows also one of the strengths, I think, of the data set, by allowing us to look at transitions in the labor market. So here we look at occupational transitions across occupational groups. And what we do here is we look at being employed in the white collar sector, blue collar sector, and low skill sector. So what you can see is that this trade shock induces strong movements between the blue collar sector, so reductions in the probability of being in the blue collar sector, and movement into the low skill sector. So what this documents is that this trade shock really really induces strong occupational changes and occupational movements over this 10-year period. This slide gives more detail maybe on the occupational characteristics. And so what we do here is that we show some evidence on imputed wages. So the longitudinal study doesn't collect wage information directly. So what we do here as a summary measure of the labor market outcomes is that we use imputed wages that uses information from the occupation, full-time, part-time status, and employment versus self-employment status. And what you can see is that for men, we see a significant negative effect of import exposure on imputed wages, but we don't see differences for females. So I should say that for the procedure for the wage imputation, that we follow a paper by Crossley, Levell, and Poupakis, which is also being presented here as part of the conference, and so that presentation takes place this Friday at 9:15. This slide gives you some indication of the partner employment responses, which we're particularly interested in because it gives us an idea of the household adjustment and the household insurance. So here you have one row for men and one row for women, and then each column corresponds to a different dimension of labor force status and employment status of the corresponding partner. And here you see that there are very pronounced differences by gender. And so when we focus on women, these results suggest that the partners of women who are affected by trade exposure, they are able to respond to this shock by changing their labor force status. So in particular, these partners have an increased probability of being in work and an increased probability of being active in the labor market. And also, and that's maybe another advantage of our data set, is that we can measure self-employment. So we observe self-employment as a labor market status, and also we see marginally significant effects here in terms of the self-employment of the partner. So what these results suggest is that the household insurance mechanism may be an important important insurance mechanism for households where one of the partners is affected by the trade shocks. Now, the literature has previously established that within households, typically these import shocks tend to have a correlation that's not very high actually. And so that basically supports the idea that it's possible to, to separately isolate the effect on one of the partners and to look at the outcome for the other partner. So let me conclude. What we do in this project here is that we investigate the long run effects on the labor market of changes in trade for the UK. And so in particular, we study the exposure to Chinese imports from that rose from the WTO accession in 2001. And one of the advantages here is that we follow individuals over a long period of time, and indeed we find persistent effects over a 10-year period. And the results suggest that the trade shock induces broad occupational transitions in response to the trade shocks. We find pronounced differences by gender, and we also find evidence that suggests that spousal labor supply may be an important insurance mechanism for these workers when they're affected by this trade shock. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please submit your question to the Q&A box. I do not see any questions. Okay. Maria, do you want to unmute yourself and
yeah, I don't know how to submit a question to the Q&A box as a presenter, sorry. So, but I have a question about your framework, is why you chose 2001. So you show in the chart at the beginning when the change in exports. So there is a shift between 2000 and 2001, and of course the accession to the WTO happens in December of 2001. So I was kind of curious. I know, I mean, maybe you choose a 10-year period. So why you chose that rather than choosing, 1 or 2 years earlier than that? So maybe that causes your results, some of your results, to be not significant. So there could be a lower bound of the effect that you find. And a second part is, so can you say, I'm Italian, so I'm thinking about Italy and the extended family insurance, can you say anything about not only spousal responses, but, if you are members, if you are a young person, so you go live with your parents, can you say anything about that? Or is there anything about the literature? Is that an important phenomenon? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. These are very good questions. Thank you. So on the first question, so that is to some extent a result of the structure of our data, in the sense that these data, the LS data, basically observe individuals every 10 years. So it's the 2001 census, the 2011 census, the 1991 census. So basically, what we're able to do is we're able to basically follow individuals over these over these decadal changes. And so we are basically starting in 2001 because that's the time point that's closest to the WTO accession. But I agree, it would be interesting, and it would be interesting to also contrast what happens earlier, and our falsification exercise does that to some extent. But our data does not allow us to do an analysis that would be year on year. So that's basically why we start in 2001. I think the second question is also really interesting, and I think the data is well suited to do that. So we haven't done that so far. So one of the things that we've already looked at is to look at differences by age groups and look at different age patterns. But I think it's a really interesting idea also to look at other members of the household, and also to think about the wider effects that may be labor market, but also more broadly that happen within the family, that not only look at spouses, but also look at other members of the household. Thank you. Yeah, this is really good questions. Thank you.
I have a question related to the insignificance of some of the results. How do you see the contribution of your paper relative to, say, the Otter Dunn Hansen paper in the US? And what do you think, what would be the drivers of the differences between your results and the other paper?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I think there are different differences between those two papers. I think the advantage that we have here is that we have very rich data that allow us to look at the household context, but that also have very good information on labor market characteristics, such as very good occupational information, and measures such as self-employment and so on. So I think it's very rich, and that allows us to give us a to describe a richer picture. And I think compared to some of the existing evidence, I think the kind of two advantages here is the kind of the long-running panel dimension and the way this data set is sampled, and then being able to look at the household responses, so to look at other outcomes.
Great, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions. Let's wait for 1 more minute. So we probably proceed. Okay, let's proceed. Thank you very much. So our next presenter will be Maria Tito from FedBoard.
Hello, everyone. I'll be sharing my screen, so you'll see me in a second. And so one of the advantages, I was thinking, I am very comfortably in DC. I can be able to see my screen now. I'm very comfortably in DC, so this is one of the advantages of doing the conference online. And thank you very much for the organizers to include me. So here in DC is noon, so it's lunchtime, a bit later there in London. And I'll proceed with my paper. So this paper is changing a little bit to the topic. We are moving. I'm moving towards the services exports, which is becoming recently a hot topic in the literature. And in fact, there's been an increased interest in trading services over the last decade. In fact, if you look at the data, there's been a surge, especially for the US, where trading services, for the recent data that we have, represent about 30% of the exports of services account to 30% of the total services which are produced in the US. So this increase in the interest on trading services has been very well shown in the data for the European countries. In fact, there's been a proliferation of studies trying to look at the characteristics of the exporters of services. In the same spirit where at the beginning of the 2000s, when the new trade literature started, we looked a lot at the characteristics of manufacturing exporters. And so the same has been done for trade for exporters in the service sector, but mostly for European countries. So you can see one of the missing the missing person here is the US. US has been is the largest exporters of services. However, the data that have been available on US firms have been rather limited. So the publicly available data, which are the data that the Bureau of Economic Analysis provides, are quite aggregated. So they're just for some sectors, and they've been expanding over time. So the coveraging is getting better, but it's still, it's macro sectors. So the firm level data is available. However, the use is pretty restrictive. So it's not really allowed for research. So you have to have really specific use to be able to access those data. So in that spirit, so because of these restrictions, a recent paper by Gervais and Jensen came around these restrictions while looking at domestic services. So looking at very detailed data on the distribution of domestic services to try to say something about the tradability of this particular sector. However, this paper kind of looks at this problem in another way. So tries to find a novel source of data for UX exporters in the service sector. And so using this novel data source, so this is like the preliminary project, the exploratory project, I look at the stylized facts in the same spirits as the early paper in the literature of the new trade theory have done. But the advantage of this data, which I'll describe in a second, is that it allows you to look at firm-to-firm transactions. So you can look at the supplier-buyer margin as well. And so the simple facts that I'm going to present to you today, I'm going to leverage on those facts to provide a calibration of the trade costs in services. And they're going to relate those to manufacturing. And you're going to see why this comparison is important in a second. So let me start with the real novel contribution, which is creating an export customs out of a well-known data source. I mean, I'm sure everybody is familiar with the CompuStat, but out of CompuStat, which collects records for public US firms, there is a part of CompuStat which you might not or might have heard before, which is the customer segment. So the public US firms have the requirement, according to a couple of statements from the financial accounting standards, to report their major transactions. So they have to report all the transactions in which the customers contribute at least 10% to their sales. However, some firms, because they report those big customers, they tend to report also transactions lower than that threshold. But if every transaction exceeds the 10% threshold, the public US firms are required to report those transactions. And the way those transactions are filed is that they include the customer names, but not always the customer names is available. And sometimes it could be some generic reference to the customer name, but they could also include some reference either to the geography where the transaction took place, or in reference to the sector the transaction refers to. So let me show you a couple of examples of how this customer segment database is constructed. So for example, this is for the Rito Group Corporation, which is a non-store retailer. So it makes, so one of the sector code is 454. And this is the 10K filing, which was filed by the company on the September 17, 2019, so about a year ago. So as you can see, within the 10K filing, the firm reports that its revenue, the contribution of its revenue from 3 customers. The customers, however, in this particular filing are not named, so they're just letters. They are letters A, B, and C. And so in the record within the CompuStat customer segment, you can see this a little bit, that firms just report generic identifiers of customers. They indicate that 1 customer, 2 customers, but there is a substantial amount of observation where you actually see the name of the firm with which they had a transaction. But this is one way. I mean, you have transactions with firms. However, sometimes you also have information in terms of geography. So for example, this is from the BHP Group, which is a firm in the mining sector. This firm, still on September 17, submitted a 20F filing, and his 20F filing, he reported all the information in terms of its customers, in terms of the geography where the transaction took place. And you can see Australia, Europe, China, and so on and so forth. So using those information, one can identify whether the transaction took place domestically or abroad. And how do I identify, so the foreign transaction indicator? How do I indicate whether there is an export transaction or a domestic transaction? So first, for all the firms which report the name of their customers, I try first to match them back to CompuStat. Because of course, in CompuStat, you have the names of the firms pretty well detailed. And out of those, I can get 74,000, about 75,000 matching in terms of once I count for the firm customer year observation. So I get a little bit of matching. So there are many more observations than that. So in fact, there are about 500,000 observations, but I can look also at the geography, exploit information of geography, and use that information to infer whether the transaction occurs domestically or abroad, whether it's an export transaction. And so given that the geographic information is more available, I'm able to identify the status of the transactions for 450,000, about 450,000 observations. So out of 500,000, so it's a large chunk of all the observations which are available within the CompuStat customer segment. So then you can think that I make the CompuStat customer segment identical to an export customs. However, there is, of course, a critique, which is quite important, is that the CompuStat sample, however, is skewed towards large firms. Not only that, but also you have a sort of sample selection in terms of what are the customers which are included in the customer segment. So these are the big customers, although sometimes firms tend to report also smaller customers. And so that's why if you want to compare to to the literature, to the existing literature, you might think that you're going to get a bias comparison, because CompuStat is skewed in both ways, in terms of firms, in terms of customers. And so in a way, in an easier way, in a more meaningful way to compare is looking at within CompuStat itself and comparing service firms to manufacturing firms and looking at their operation abroad, especially. And this is what I'll be showing next. So what type of comparison I will be showing next. In particular, I will be focusing on an analysis of cross-sectional characteristics, dynamic characteristics, and then I'll use mostly the cross-sectional characteristics to try to construct the trade costs for the service sector. There is another caveat that I'd like for you to keep in mind during my presentation, is that the exporters that I'm considering exporters of services are really exporters in the service sector. So I don't really have information on the products that those firms are trading. So sometimes there is some information in terms of the segment, the type of sector to which those products are flowing, but there is not details in terms of the product. So it's not a real export customs in the full sense of the word. And one way to try to address this problem is to look at the sector of the customers themselves. So look a little bit of the information, if it's available, on the sector towards those products are going, to get an idea whether they are actually exporting goods or are exporting services. Of course, even if you are a service firm, you may be, and you are selling something to a firm which is in the manufacturing sector, for example, you may still be serving goods. So this is not a full robustness checks, but is one way to try to build robustness on the data. So with this caveat in mind, so this is really statistics about firms which are in the service sector. Let me go and show you the characteristics of this data. So we'll start with a cross-sectional analysis. So the first characteristics that I'd like to show you is in terms of export participation, as well as what fraction of the revenues are exported and being exported. As you recall, these are the very early characteristics that we have been familiar after the Mellitz 2003 paper. The other element that I want to talk about is what is the service sector? What do I consider as being service sector? So I'm showing you the specific NAICS, the specific sector industries which are considered. And overall, I'm thinking of services as everything that includes either retail, trade, transportation and warehousing, as well as business services and personal services. But I'm showing you the statistics for individual groups. However, when I talk about the service sector, in general, I include all those groups of industries together. So this table looks at the export participation as well as the value of export, the share of revenues which is exported, the export value share, and compares them with the manufacturing sector. So as you can see, there is a large discrepancy in terms of the fraction of exporters in each of those sectors relative to manufacturing. And so the manufacturing statistics comes from the Bernard and other paper 2007. And so you can see that in manufacturing, the statistic that is reporting in the table is the one that comes out of CompuStat itself, but it is actually not very far from what Bernard and others report in their 2007 paper. And if we compare relative to the service sector relative to manufacturing, we see that there is a large discrepancy. In fact, there is the fraction of exporters is as low as 15% in retail trade, but it can be high as 35% in transportation as warehousing, while manufacturing is 41%. And in terms of export value share, we see that there is also quite a big difference. It's not quite as large. In fact, the export value share varies from 18% to 32%, while for manufacturing is 35%. And the fact that the discrepancy, the difference in the export value share is a little bit smaller could account for the fact that services exporter actually tend to sell also goods. So they don't export only services, but they could export also goods, something that we cannot directly check about. One other thing that I'd like to mention is how do this finding compare with the literature? So they're actually pretty much in line if we look at the paper of Vogel and Wagner. Also, this paper is on German data and really focuses on large firms. So they also find a participation in the order of 15 to 25%. So you can see that the Compustat data is not that far from what is reported for Germany. So among the other characteristics, in a first exploration of the data is how do the exporters look compared to non-exporters within the service sectors. And so we looked at the exporters' premia. And this is a pretty standard, so as in Bernard and others are looking at the exporter premia for a bunch of characteristics such as the employment, so the first line in the table, the revenues, the market valuation, the output per worker, but with the Compustat data, we can also look at capital expenditure, one of the characteristics which is not standard in the literature, as well as capital per worker. And so you can see there are differences, there are significant differences, except for the output per worker characteristics. And those differences tend to endure even if you control for the size of the firm. This is simply to parallel what has been done for the manufacturing literature, for the exporters in manufacturing literature. So we also see that there are the exporters in manufacturing tend to be better, to be a higher revenue, tend to be more productive, although productivity here in terms of output work, it is not that much different. However, one can think, so, but are exporters in services really different from manufacturing exporters? And this is the results that I'm going to show you next. So when you interact the export dummy with the service dummy, so to capture the exporters in the service sectors, you don't really see much differences except for the market valuation. So you see that in terms of revenue, productivity, or capital expenditure, or output per worker, capital per worker, there's not much of a difference. However, there are some differences in terms of market valuation. And this is going to be important when we look at the distribution of firms in the service sector versus the manufacturing sector. So this is going to tell us a little bit how the distribution of firms in two sectors behave. So overall, we can think that the premia are not significantly different between firms that are exporters in either of those two sectors. In addition, I also explore what are the different margins of the exporter firms. So if you think of a firm that exports, there are a few margins that contribute to the total exports of a firm. So of course, there is the average export, which is the intensive margin, but also the firm is going to export to customers which are located across countries, and those customers across countries have a certain density. And so if you decompose those, this is an identity, decompose the total exports of a firm a certain period of time, the interesting result is that the intensive margin is really what's driving those results. And this is similar to other papers in the literature, in particular Brian Leake and Chris Cuolo, which uses data for the UK, Federico Entosti, which instead uses data for Italy. So find something very similar. However, if you compare it with the manufacturing literature, so the exporters in manufacturing, you tend to find something which is a little bit different. You tend to find that instead the extensive margin, which are characterized a bit differently, mostly in terms of products, countries, and density, they tend to have a much more important role. One of the possibilities of the interpretation of the results, how the intensive margin is so dominant, for example, other extensive margins such as the customer margin doesn't have a much more important role, could be a byproduct of the fact that we are really focusing on a bunch of customers, we're a limited number of customers, so we're really cutting the distribution of customers through the rule of having only the largest customers. So those customers account for the 10% of the revenues of the firm.
However, we have 5 minutes left. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no worries. Thank you, Lou. However, because we have the data, we would like to look in more details at what are the customers. So this is one of the advantages of this data source, having to know exactly the transactions. And we actually know a lot of the characteristics of the customers for those which we are able to match back into contest data. So what we see is a little bit reflections of what we see in general in the export markets for manufacturing firms, is that you tend to have some concentration in the customer margin. So you have a lot of firms that, this corresponds to the blue line in the chart, dark blue line in the chart, that tend to export to a single customer. So more than half of the firm in the data set do that. However, those firms tend to account for a very small share if you look at the value that's been exported or the employment share. Instead, if you look at firms which have a larger number of customers, they are a more important role. So they are more prominent. So those are really the superstar also in our data. Second question that we can leverage in terms of the customer is, how is the matching working between the buyers and the customers and the firms and the suppliers? And this is what I'm going to highlight next. The fact is that even in this database, which is already skewed towards large customers, the big customers really dominate the matching. And this is something that you see in the chart on the left, where you see some negative assortativity over the number of customers. So we see that the large customers tend to connect with the small suppliers and the large suppliers. However, the small customers only tend to connect with the large suppliers. This fact, however, is still consistent with the positive assortativity. So with the fact that if you are big customers, you always want to have big suppliers, if you look at in terms of their size, and to look in terms of their exports. So I'll quickly summarize also the dynamic analysis, which looks at the variation over time across the exporters, looking at their entry and the exit and their survival. And there are two main facts that tend to emerge. So the first fact is that there is a higher turnover for the exporters in services. So if you look at whether there are entrants, exiting, and what's the exit by entrants, it tends to be much higher than what you have for the manufacturing sectors. And of course, I mean, when you look at the exiting firms, you're going to see that those firms tend to perform worse than the continuing firms. A second fact is looking at the survival, and the survival statistics are survival rates are much higher for firms in the manufacturing sectors than they are for services. So you see this discrepancy between the probability of survival in the number of years after entry, which is shown on the x-axis, is a wedge which tends to shrink over time, but it takes a while until this wedge completely shrinks to zero. So what do we do with all these facts? So these facts are actually compatible with differences in trade costs. So there are three main differences that we find. The first is that there is participation rate and export value share differences, which is lower in service than in manufacturing. So the size premia are higher for market capitalization, but not very different for along other dimensions. And also the differences in survival rates tend to be different. And so if we take those facts together, we can come up with the estimates of how trade costs tend to be different across the two sectors. And there is a very simple way to try to look at implications, numerical implications for trade costs. So if we simply look at the framework by Melis and Chenet, we can look at two main conditions which can allow us to back out the variable trade cost as well as the fixed trade cost. So the very first condition is the one that allows us to look at the differences in variable trade costs. So inspired by the Melis-Chenet model, so the firms are going to set higher export prices in the foreign markets, reflecting the higher marginal cost of serving those markets. So in other words, if you look at the ratio between their export sales and the domestic sales, those should reflect the higher trade costs, variable trade costs that they need to overcome in order to sell abroad. But also we know that in those models, the foreign sales, the successful exporters, they have to cover the fixed cost of exporting. And this is the second condition that is going to allow us to tell something about the fixed trade cost. However, there is one, so we want to identify, so tau, we'll identify F. However, there is a couple of complications. So the first complication is that we have the elasticity of substitution. So in the first round, we backed them out from Gervais and Jensen estimate for sigma, which are also applied for the US, although those are applied to the US domestic market. But we are exploring also what would happen if we would identify sigma just using our conditions. These results are not in the paper present. And the second complication is the fact that we need to have a unit of observation for our second condition in terms of the fixed cost, so which is the unit you're paying the fixed cost of exporting in. And to take care of that problem, so we are going to look at the ratio of the fixed cost in services relative to manufacturing. So let me show you quickly the results, and then I'll conclude. So the variable trade cost, you're going to get a ranking. So we get an estimate for the variable trade cost for each of those sectors. And an interesting fact is that, as you would expect, is that manufacturing tend to have the lowest variable trade cost. It's not really the lowest in our data. Actually, transportation is rising, probably for the characteristics of the sector that is actually shifting goods across the country and across borders, is actually has lower trade costs. But all the other industries have higher, way higher trade costs than manufacturing. In particular, real estate and leasing, and you can imagine that real estate is linked to a physical location, and you really need to travel to that location to take care of the services of that particular building, has the highest variable trade cost in our framework. As for fixed trade cost, so here I'm showing you the total differences decomposed along the differences in elasticity, which come directly from the Gervais and Jensen, and the difference in participation, so which comes from the identification condition of the firms which are actually entering the export market. So you can look at the participation if you want to abstract from the elasticity differences that we take from the Gervais and Jensen. And as a reminder, so those differences are all relative to the manufacturing sector. So if you think of wholesale trade, so in wholesale trade, you have a difference between 9% and 27%. The fixed costs are higher relative to the manufacturing sector. And so just a little addition is that in order to back out those differences, we also need to make an assumption in terms of the distribution of firms, how the firms behave in a particular sector, and we're going to assume that those firms are Pareto, and we're going to have to estimate the Pareto distribution as well. So to conclude, sorry to go over my time, so what we find is that there are differences in a few main characteristics between exporters in manufacturing and exporters in services, and those are related to participation rate, export value shares, and premia. Those are compatible with differences in trade cost. And if we look at on average across all the service sector, so there are 10% differences in costs, in trade costs for service exporters relative to manufacturing exporters. I mentioned before, there is also a difference in terms of probability survival. Actually, this also fact can tell us something in terms of the ratio between sunk to fixed costs relative to manufacturing. And what the difference in probability survival tells us is that the ratio of sunk to fixed costs, actually it's lower for services relative to manufacturing, although we haven't really made an estimate for that, for the particular sectors. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Okay, see a question from Peter Levell. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, yes, thank you very much. That was a very clear presentation. Sorry, I don't know how to switch on my video. So my question, so one of the issues that comes up quite a lot in the Brexit debate is the effects of different trade agreements on the fixed cost of participation, fixed cost of exporting, variable cost of exporting, and how that is relevant for firms of different sizes. So I was wondering if, using your data, you can use the fact that you know which country the partner firms are in, whether you could investigate that, using differences in the trade agreements the US has across different trade partners, or other aspects of trade costs.
Oh, definitely, that's a great question. It's a great point, Peter. I think you could. I'm just thinking whether you slice the data too much a little bit, so the data is not So the number of data points is good if you keep it a bit aggregated, but if you keep slicing, in fact, at first I did estimates for a much finer level of sectors, and then in some cases I can really get a theory approved estimate. So I suspect you can. So you have some variation in geography. I just worried in terms of combining the variation in geography with the variation in sector. Maybe you can get it aggregated, but probably you can. Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll look into it. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have a question related to your definition of this service exporters. It seems that the service exporter also sell goods. There is possibility they also sell goods, right?
Yeah.
But for your counterpart, so if you have this manufacturing sector, are they also possibly sell services? Or they okay?
Yeah.
So it's somehow you're estimating a lower bound of all these effects. You're not entirely kept. I see.
Yeah. So even for exporters of exporters in the manufacturing sectors, I think there's been recent data. I can't remember which country, which actually look at this. It's Belgium. It's RU that has a paper that looks at what type of product and distinguishes between goods and services. But even those data are difficult to find. I mean, not every country has them. So, but definitely, I mean, it's capturing. On some sense, it's a lower bound, but on the other hand, it could be a upper bound because those are really big firms. So it's a bit difficult to kind of know which way the bias goes. But yeah, they're definitely. So that's why I like it to keep it within Compustat itself and say, okay, these are the exporters in services. This is what they do, and exporters in manufacturing do, and then look outside the literature, see how do they compare with the literature. So
I have a second question, which is you seem to link these differences in the distribution as a result of the differences in trade cost. Did you also investigate the entry cost of these firms? So if you just look at those firms selling domestically for the service firms rather compared to the manufacturing firm, do they have same level of concentration, or if they have different level of concentration, it could be just they have different entry costs rather than the trade cost?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's definitely a very good point. It's a little bit what the I haven't investigated that, but it's a little bit what the survival probability differences could tell you, because it's the sunk cost of really entering the market, right? So it would be really interesting to look into that. In fact, I'd like to. I think this could be leveraged even more into the domestic transactions data. You know, looking at differences between just entry into the market and whether you're becoming an exporter. But yeah, that's a really great point.
Yeah, thanks. I do not see any more questions. Probably let me proceed with my presentation. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Right, so let me just introduce. So this is Luhan from University of Liverpool presenting on the mutable geography of firms' international trade, evidence and macroeconomic implications. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We know that the international trade is dominated by large firms that sell to many destinations. For instance, among Chinese exporters, 75% of trade transactions and 95% of trade values originate from firms selling to more than one destination. Similar statistics hold for the UK, Belgium, France, etc. So understanding the export decisions of these firms is a key for both trade and open macro literature. Conventionally, we think that once a firm starts exporting to a market, it will keep selling there. This would imply that the settled destination market served by a firm is relatively stable. However, if we look at the highly disaggregated data of customer transactions, a very interesting feature of these multi-destination exporters is that the settled destination markets served by these firms is actually very volatile. So this table gives you an example of the trade pattern of a Chinese exporter selling t-shirts. You can see the trade pattern of this exporter has changed quite a lot over these 4 years. In the year 2004, the firm stopped exporting to Japan and started exporting to Germany. And in the year 2005, the firm stopped exporting to South Korea and exported to Japan again. In this paper asks the following questions. At the macro level, how do we quantify these within firm changes in trade patterns? And what are the drivers of these market changes? And from the macro level, do these market changes matter for aggregate fluctuations and welfare? In particular, how do they impact our analysis of recent bilateral events, such as the US-China trade war or Britain leaving the EU? This paper consists of two parts. Empirically, I create new measures and document new facts on firm and foreign product level market changes based on two large customers databases, which covers the universe of trade transactions of British and Chinese exporters. I find this within firm market changes firstly involve substantial market switching. Among 30 to 40% of these market changes involve firms simultaneously add and drop markets. Secondly, these market changes are not purely idiosyncratic, but they're endogenous to changes in local market conditions. In a variance decomposition, I find 20% of these market changes are associated with fluctuations in exchange rates and changes in local price levels. And finally, the price and quantity adjustments along with these market changes seem to suggest systematic changes in demand conditions in all markets. Firms dropping more markets also tend to have very big drop in quantity in those continuing markets, in the markets a firm continues to sell. But there is very little change in the prices in these continuing markets. Theoretically, I build a multi-country general equilibrium model to quantify the sources of these market changes and their aggregate impacts. In the model, the firm optimally choose their optimal markups and settle destination markets in response to shocks. The systematic demand change can be generated naturally in the model through competition. For example, if my competitor receives a positive productivity shock and becomes more competitive, it will become more competitive everywhere in all markets. This is going to reduce my residual demand. I'm going to sell less in some markets and I'm going to exit some other markets. A promising use of the model is to study how a bilateral shock transmits in a multi-country framework. In particular, I find incorporating these market changes has important implication for the third country that is not directly involved in the bilateral event. Let me elaborate a little bit more on the model and the experiment. Essentially, I simulate a model of 3 countries. Within each country, there is a continuum of industries. And within each industry, there is a limited number of domestic and foreign firms competing with each other. As you can see from the figure here, in country C, there are 4 domestic firms and 4 foreign competitors. Suppose there is a sudden increase in the bilateral trade cost between C and A, what happens to the prices, trade flows, and aggregate welfare in all of these countries? More importantly, how do the responses differ once we have taken into account these endogenous market choices? The model predicts a very clear trade deflection effect. The 2 warring countries going to trade less with each other, and each of them going to buy more from the third country that is not directly involved in the event. And this leads to an export boom for the third country, for country B. A very important mechanism in the model is that this export boom going to lead to an appreciation of the third country's currency. This makes the products of the 2 other countries relatively cheaper in the third country, which means they're going to also sell more to the third country. Incorporate these endogenous market choices will have a small negative impact of the 2 warring countries, but makes a big difference for the third country that is not directly involved in the bilateral event, as you can see from the figure here. So entry into the third country by exporters from the other 2 warring countries intensifies the competition within the third country, improving the efficiency and bring in additional welfare gain about 10%. Let me skip the literature due to the time constraints. In what follows, I'm going to discuss the new measures I constructed and use some new measures to study these market changes and local market conditions, and to link the extensive as well as intensive margin adjustments in those continuing markets. I will briefly talk about the model and discuss model implications through a bilateral trade war scenario. So let's think about how can we measure these market changes. Consider a firm selling a product to 4 countries, A, B, C, D, over 4 time periods. The left-hand side figure gives you an example of this particular firm. This is really a typical pattern observed in a customer database. The right-hand side gives you the identified trade patterns and associated activities. I create 2 very simple measures to decompose these market changes. The first one is the number of markets that have changed divided by total number of markets the firm exports to in a particular time period. And the second one is a proportion of markets that have been dropped divided by the total number of markets that have changed. As you can see from this illustration here, the first measure captures the magnitude of market changes. From period 1 to period 2, 2 markets have changed. Market B has been dropped and market C has been added, and the firm exports to 2 markets, A and C, so the market change to markets measure is 2 divided by 2, which is equal to 1. The drop change ratio captures the direction of the market changes. If a firm only adds markets, the drop change ratio will be 1. If a firm only drops markets, the drop change ratio will be, if a firm only adds markets, the drop change ratio will be 0. If a firm only drop markets, the drop change ratio will be 1. If a firm simultaneously add and drop markets, the drop change ratio will be in between 0 and 1. Similarly, I construct the corresponding value measures by using the trade values associated with these market changes rather than just counting the number of markets that have changed. So this table gives you the median value of the market change to market measure for Chinese exporters. Each different row gives you results calculated at a different disaggregation level. As you can see from this upper panel here, a typical Chinese exporter changes more than half of its markets on a year-to-year basis. Very similar results are obtained from the British exporters. The British exporters has a little bit more stable trade patterns, but in general, you find these statistics are very comparable. The market drop to market change measure is about 0.5, which means there is equal probability of market being dropped and versus the market being added. If I trace the same firm or the same firm product over time, I find 1/3 of these market changes involve a firm simultaneously add and drop markets. After seeing all these statistics, a very important question is whether these market changes are driven by systematic changes, which matters for aggregate fluctuations and welfare, or purely idiosyncratic shocks, which will be aggregated to 0. So in what follows, I'm going to use this drop change ratio to investigate the relationship between the market changes and the changes in local market conditions, and to link the extensive margin adjustments with the intensive margin adjustments. So firstly, to what extent are these market changes explained by fluctuations in local market conditions? I'm going to answer this question in 2 steps. In the first step, we'll construct firm and firm product level measures of changes in local market conditions, focusing on those markets that have changed. In the second step, I will regress the drop change ratio, which captures the direction of the market change, on the constructed measure and see the variation explained by the constructed measures. Oops. To give you an example, this figure gives you the construction of these relative measures for bilateral change rates. Essentially, I group the markets into 2 bins. Those markets a firm continues to sell, and those markets that have changed from one period to the next. And then calculate the changes in relative exchange rates using the changes in exchange rate for the markets that have been added relative to the changes in exchange rate for the markets that have been dropped. Then I'm going to regress this drop change ratio on the changes in relative exchange rates and changes in relative local price levels with a bunch of fixed effects. The table gives you results for the Chinese exporters. The upper panel gives you results where the drop change ratio is measured by counting the number of countries, and the bottom panel gives you the result where drop change ratio is calculated by using the trade value associated with those market changes. As you can see, these results are quite comparable, so they're quite consistent. A negative coefficient on exchange rate means the firm is less likely to drop the market if the destination market's exchange rate appreciates relative to the other markets. So if you think about a Chinese firm selling to the UK and Canada, if the Canadian dollar appreciates relative to sterling, the firm is less likely to drop the Canadian market. As you can see from the within R square column here, we find a non-trivial proportion of the variation explained solely by these two variables. This is not what you usually observe for intensive margins. So I now want to show you how this drop change ratio can be a good measure to link extensive and intensive margin adjustments. In particular, I'm going to investigate how firms' price and quantity changes in those continuing markets are related to their drop change ratio, essentially the proportion of markets that have been dropped. As you can see from this figure here, I'm going to calculate the changes in unit values or the quantities for those continuing markets and regress it on the drop change ratio. This table shows you the results for the Chinese and British exporters. For the first column, we have the results regressing the changes in unit value in those continuing markets on the drop change ratio. And the second column gives you the results regressing the changes in mean quantity on the drop change ratio. As you can see from the table here, the firm drops more markets seem to also reduce sales in those continuing markets, as you can see from this table here. But there's very little change in price. This seems to suggest a systematic change in demand in all of a firm's markets. For example, as a result of competition, if my competitor suddenly become more competitive, it will become more competitive in all markets, and it reduces my residual demand in all markets. This is unlikely to be driven entirely by supply changes, because we would expect to have a much bigger change in the prices for quantity drops at such big magnitude. In what follows, I will highlight the key components of the model and discuss the model implications through a bilateral trade war scenario. There are two key elements of the model. The first one is variable markets. Essentially, I have more than 2 countries in the world, and the firms make entry and price decisions in each country separately in each time period. In order to capture the aggregate impacts of these market changes, I incorporate 2 variable markup channels. The first one is demand competition by local and international producers, as in Atkinson, Burston, and Edmund Midrigan Xu. Essentially, in this framework, the optimal markup is a function of your market share, which depends on the entry and exit of your competitors. The second element is to allow for a certain degree of the local cost component. So in order to distribute 1 unit of your product to the consumer, you would need to pay for a service fee or a certain retail distribution cost. And this existence of the local cost components drives a wedge between the producer price and the consumer price, making the demand elasticity a function of the distribution margin or the distribution of the local cost component. A key extension of this paper relative to the previous papers is to allow firms to compete by simultaneously choosing their optimal markets as well as markups in this multi-country framework. In the next few minutes, I would like to discuss these implications of the market changes on the aggregate welfare and the markups.
You have about five more minutes. Sorry to interrupt.
Great, thanks. So essentially, I calibrate the model to match the newly documented statistics, and then I simulate the model for 2 time periods. In the first time period, the model reaches its competitive equilibrium. And in the second time period, I give a sudden increase in the bilateral trade cost between the 2 countries, A and C here. So I studied percentage changes in variables from 1 period to the next. So you may ask, why should we care about this market changes? One answer to this question is it has big impact on the distribution of markups. So this left-hand side figure gives you the changes in mean markups of exporters from country C to country A. You can think about country C as China, country A as the US. And we have two lines here. The first one, the empty squared line is a benchmark model of the variable markets version. And the solid square line is a fixed market version of the model. Essentially, I restrict the set of destination markets to be the same in both time periods. If we focus on the solid square line of the model, we see the firm significantly drops their markups as the bilateral tariffs increases. This is essentially because they want to absorb part of the tariff changes into their markups to avoid very big drops in their demand, as can be predicted typically by an oligopolistic competition model. Well, if we take into account these endogenous market choices, you see that the mean markup does not really change much in this bilateral trade war scenario. This is essentially because allowing firms to reallocate brings in two additional effects. There is a positive selection effect because only very productive firms from country C will keep exporting to country A. These firms are in general larger and charge higher markups. This is going to push up the markup distribution. There will be two competition effects. There will be less competition due to exits of less productive exporters from country C to country A, but there will be also more competition due to entrance of the exporters from the third country, from country B to country A. At the end of the day, this effects add up to zero, and you do not see much difference for the mean markups. As to the aggregate effects, we see the two varying countries suffer substantially from the trade war scenario. For a 20 percentage point increase in the bilateral tariffs, we see nearly 3% drop in the aggregate productivity. And the third country benefit from this bilateral trade war scenario. And the increase in the aggregate productivity is about 1%. The table here gives you the percentage difference in the responses between the fixed market model and the variable markets model. We can see also the difference is quite small for the variable markets model for these two varying countries, but there is a non-trivial difference for the third country that is not directly involved in the bilateral event. Very similar results, similar patterns of the differences you observe if we also change different components of the model and change the calibration a little bit. To quickly sum up, this paper studies the within firm market changes based on two large customer databases. Empirically, I find these within firm market changes firstly involve substantial market switching and are endogenous to changes in relative market conditions, such as exchange rates and local price levels, and suggest systematic changes in demand conditions, not only in those markets that have been changed, but in those markets a firm continue to sell. Theoretically, I build a multi-country general equilibrium model, where I find that incorporating these market changes has important implications on the distribution of markups. And the third country definitely benefits more from the bilateral trade war scenario once we have incorporated these endogenous market changes. Taken together, I think this is a step towards building a realistic multi-country framework that captures the key features of intensive as well as extensive margin adjustments across markets, which enables us to analyze the recent, the global impacts of the recent bilateral and multilateral events. Thank you very much. Let me stop sharing. How do I make it small? Okay. Any questions?
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so if we have any questions, now would be a great time. Let me maybe start with one question. So you kind of emphasized the spillover effects of trade wars in your empirical analysis. Are you able to say something about the geographic nature of these spillovers? So are they regionally concentrated, or are they quite dispersed? Are you able to say something about that?
That's a very good question. So we do find this market drop or market changes are more pronounced for this long distance markets. So for the higher the markets with that are not easily reachable by the producers, depends on which country we're talking about. And in terms of the magnitude of the effects, we do not see a much big difference in terms of the coefficients of this effect of this long distance and short distance markets. Of course, this the markets or the changes depends on the destinations or the countries, which country you're talking about. For the British exporters, it's definitely you observe less changes for those EU markets compared to the US market and long distance markets. But for China, it's more about the Korean markets versus the US market or the European markets. So it depends on which country you're looking at. We look at.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have any other questions?
How do I?
Oh, yeah, you're muted. I muted myself. Thank you, Matthias. So to follow up on Matthias' point, so does the order matter? I know there's a few papers that kind of say which market you enter first. So maybe matter for which markets you're gonna enter second. You know, so,
Yeah,
your model is kind of arrives at starts with general equilibrium. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, so there is a clear ordering effects if you look at the cross-sectional variations. So definitely the shorter distance or the higher income countries or higher demand would induce a more entry. But what I'm looking at in the paper is to more like focusing on the dynamics of these changes on top of these ordering effects that have been documented in the literature. So it's essentially looking at how this ordering effect will be different, or these patterns will be different over time, and how these changes are related to systematic factors such as exchange rates and local price levels.
Thanks, great. But is there also heterogeneity in terms of other characteristics? I mean, beyond the ordering. So one thing that I was thinking is whether, I mean, you are a more older firm and more experienced firms. Maybe that's the reason why you just do less switching, maybe. But I mean, but you don't really have data on the firm, you know, how old is the firm? So this is export customs. But for example, if you looked in 2016, the last couple of years, 15 and 16, for example, for the UK, or 2005, 2006 for China, you see differences whether you are a product, product that you've been exported for longer. So I don't know, this was one of the things. So maybe you are less responsive because it's to the market condition, because it's an old product.
Yes, we do find larger firms tend to have a little bit, as you can see from this table, has a little bit more stable trade pattern. And I also break this down by different types of firms. Especially for China, we know the financial properties of the register of the firms, and by different types of the trade mode, and by different classification of different types of products, like different level of differentiations. You see, like especially for the Chinese data, you have lots of processing trade. And this processing trade tend to have a very stable trade pattern compared to the more general trade. And most of these changes happens in the differentiated products. And also we find if these market changes are mainly concentrated on those private enterprises and state-owned enterprises compared to the foreign invested enterprises. Essentially, if you build this joint venture or this foreign related enterprise, then they kind of have a very stable relationship, and this relationship does not really change over time. So I think there is a dynamic effect, as well as there are heterogeneities across products and firms.
Thanks, it's very interesting.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
One more question. Are you able to look at reversals of decisions as well, where there's a change, and then then in the subsequent periods to see whether that decision is reversed again?
Yeah. So if I think the best example here is if I go back to slide 1. So essentially, this is what I often observe in the customs database.
Yeah, thanks.
And essentially, I measure these trade patterns as so. This trade pattern is Australia, South Korea, and Germany. So essentially, I'm trying to understand why sometimes it's Australia, South Korea, Japan versus Australia, South Korea, Germany, and then it's Australia and Japan, Germany again. I think the flips or the reverses could be due to these movements of the exchange rates, as well as local price levels, and also the changes in the systematic changes in a firm's competitors. So in the market, in the level of competition in those markets.
Great, thank you. Yeah, really interesting. Thanks. Do we have any other questions?
That's great. I think we can end the session now.